Welcome to the Mental Insights Podcast. This is your host, Brendan.cutuli, and we're here today for episode number 17 with Kristi Horner. Kristi is going to be sharing a lot about mental health, mental illness, the effects that it has on not only the experiencer, but the people around the one who is experiencing a mental illness. And we're going to speak more about her organization, a nonprofit called Courage to Caregivers, which is located in Northeast Ohio, which really focuses on providing hope, support, and courage to caregivers and loved ones of those who are living with a mental illness. So they provide a lot of support, groups, activities, and so forth about how to help caregivers that are going through these issues within the field. So Chrissy will really be able to dive into a lot of these topics. But if you just want to introduce yourself and share with the audience a little bit more about who you are and what else you are doing throughout your everyday. And, it's such a pleasure to have you on, and I'm really excited for this conversation. So thank you again for making your schedule available for me and allowing the audience to hear the great work that you're doing today.
Oh, you're so kind. Well, it's an honor to be talking with you today. So thank you for the time, Brendan, and thank you for reaching out and following the work of Courage to Caregivers in our launch. So thank you. I love how we align, and I love how you're thinking and the work that you're doing in both of your podcasts. So just a little bit about me. I am, I guess, just a middle-aged, regular woman here living in Northeast Ohio. I have 3 emerging young adult kids. I have a fabulous rescue dog named Bailey who keeps me busy most days. He offers a lot of pet therapy too, by the way. I love to work in my garden where I'm fresh from that today because it's actually sunny and dry, which has been unusual up here. And really spend most of my time the work with Courage to Caregivers. Really, I don't see it as work. It's my encore, if you will, passion project. I've had a career in really developing people, if you will, through fundraising, special events, director of volunteers, and an admission director stint. I sold some jewelry for a little while. So this is really my encore, if you will, and it truly is a passion project. So that's just a little bit about me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristi. I really appreciate that. And it's so great to see that you have all of these different passions that you're able to follow through with. And I think it speaks a lot about, you're saying this is your encore, this is your passion, and to show that you are spending this part of your career as giving back and supporting others. It's a true testament to who you are and why this is such an important topic and such an important field that needs all the support it can, because there's a lot of people that are struggling with the issues of mental illness, and there's a lot of caregivers who are assisting these patients. So there's a lot of room for growth, and that's why I was so adamant to hear more about Courage Caregivers and what truly brought you to the point of passion, inspiration to perform and create this wonderful nonprofit organization. I think, the best way to start off, and, it is a very important and key aspect in terms of what provides passion. And I think a lot of people who experience or want to serve others usually have either a firsthand experience or a third person experience through one of these issues. So I have to ask you, how has mental illness and mental health affected you, or even what kind of role has mental health played within your everyday life?
Right. So, and it's such an important distinction, mental health and mental illness. And I've learned a lot in the last 5 years about the very subtle nuance there, because I would like to look at this as, first of all, mental health is just as important as physical health, right? So you and I both know that so well. And taking care of your mental health needs to be just as much of a priority for every single person as your physical health. I was really, when I started this project, looking at it through the lens of mental wellness and how can we bring people to a place of mental wellness. But I had some good advice from an advisor along the way that said, hey, if you're going to try to really help reduce the stigma of mental illness, which has been around for 3,000 years, then you've got to call it what it is. So you have to use the word mental illness. And I was really looking at it as a position of weakness versus strength, but we really just need to call it what it is. Someone who's living with a brain difference or a challenge, really it has a mental illness. And so I think acceptance is that first step. And so for me personally, it started with a phone call in June of 2010 from my little brother, and he was 9 years younger than me. He called just out of the blue on a regular day and said, and shared that he wanted to end his life. And it was really quite shocking, to be honest. We knew he wasn't managing. We knew that he had some struggles, and yet we didn't realize just how bad it had become. And so while I did not have official training, I still don't actually, in behavioral health, I am a trained Stephen minister, and now a Stephen ministry leader within my congregation. And that's a non-denominational ministry that lay leaders are trained in a curriculum to provide one-on-one caring support to someone else in the congregation, to basically leverage the work of the pastor when in a growing congregation where you cannot meet everyone's needs. And so I knew enough to ask some really hard questions because I had been trained as a listener, essentially. And I knew enough to ask my brother, did he have a plan? And he did. And to be honest, that was really hard to hear. That was one of our hardest conversations. And so you have to listen, and then you have to ask next, do you have the means to carry out that plan? And fortunately, at that moment, he did not have the means to carry out that plan. And so my blood pressure came down a little bit, and I knew that with his suicidal ideation that things were still really, really bad. But I said, hey, I can be there in a couple hours. He lived out of state. And knowing that I could come and just having this conversation, he started to calm down and started to feel better knowing I could get there. Meanwhile, I'm texting my husband, get me on the next flight to out of state, and he was working that. I was able to get to my brother by about 2:30 that afternoon. And the work started right then. I stayed for about 2 weeks. My other sister who was available came and spent 2 weeks as well, really focused on his wife and small kids at the time. And we just focused on getting a care plan in place so that we could really get a better understanding of what he was dealing with. And it turns out he cited his brain difference, his mental illness, back to when he was an adolescent, at a really tumultuous time, at a time of transition and trauma-based, if you will, depression, anxiety, and we knew he had obsessive thinking, obsessive compulsive disease of some kind. And what happened was he had been managing this his entire life. For about 30 years, he'd been managing these pretty big things. And I think we all know people who are smiley and happy looking on the outside and yet really quite depressed and sad on the inside. And there's a difference, which I think we'll get to probably later, about depressed thinking and clinical depression. He really did have clinical depression, and he had his gallbladder out just about 18 months before this call to me. And he said that this having his gallbladder out left him in chronic pain, which took him all the way to the Mayo Clinic. And the Mayo Clinic basically said, there's nothing physically wrong with you. There's nothing else we can do. And so he was left having to manage his chronic pain that was left from the surgery, as well as all of these brain differences. And suddenly he could no longer manage them all. And so a lot of balls were dropping. So we really focused during those 2 weeks to get a care plan of looking at acceptance, of course, but also counseling and therapy for himself, for the family, and really knowing that he had to kind of own this and work on it. Ultimately, what followed were 4 years of my sisters and I providing his primary caregiving, albeit long distance, to our brother for 4 years. And we like to say, I do, that he lost his battle with mental illness to suicide. No one wants to end the pain I'm sorry, no one wants to end their life. They want to end the pain. And so he did not feel he could take any more and ultimately lost his battle by ending his life on May 30th in 2014. So at that moment, we learned a lot about caregiving and we felt like it was time to pay it forward. We knew that no one else should have to suffer or support someone and feel so alone like we did for those 4 years.
Thank you for that, Kristi. I appreciate that raw conversation and story about what brought you to where you are today. I really appreciate and am super grateful that you are here today and sharing this story, because you are providing a lot of people listening the experience and opportunity to feel a similar relationship and experience to maybe what they have before. You touched on a lot of great topics that I do want to bring up again. The first one being the differentiation between mental illness, mental health, and you speaking about why you need to call it mental illness, because I have seen a lot of people trying to categorize it now as mental wellness. And
Right.
for a second I thought, maybe that is a really good route, but I do agree with what you're saying, that we can't try to always lead it to being a positive. And that's something that I've learned is, we still have to share and speak about those negatives, and mental illness being that scary, that dark word that people don't want to associate with. But I do agree. It really needs to be touched upon and shared that way, instead of, just saying we want to focus on being a mentally well individual, because then that kind of completely switches the debate. So I'm really happy you brought that up.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate you speaking about, your brother's story and what you were able to face and really experience as your brother was going through these issues. I think it's a true testament to you and your sisters for offering up your time, your availability, your support to do everything that you can for your brother to lead him into that direction. I think that's a common cause for a lot of people today, is that doctors or therapists or so forth will not really offer the availability of, you know, are you still dealing with physical pain and mental pain? And I think the focus on both needs to be prioritized, and there needs to be a a similar respect in terms of how they begin to treat and really support these issues in both physical and mental health. They need to be treated the same. They need to be focused on the same. Doctors really need to start analyzing patients in that way. And I think that's why, it's very tough to see how people will seek out that route of ending their life via suicide, because they do want to get rid of that pain, and that's the only thing that they're trying to escape from.
Exactly.
Which it's it's so terrible to hear every single story. The World Health Organization, it's one of the scariest statistics that I continue to read today, is that they say that around 800,000 people are committing suicide each year. And that's a staggering number for everyone around the world. That's opening eyes, and that needs to be reduced severely. Your brother is one person who was experiencing that issue and unfortunately fell due to that, but it created such a positive spark within your life for you to want to say, all right, I experienced something negative, I lost my brother, but the turnaround, the creative aspect of what you were able to bring light out of your brother's experience, out of your experience, out of your whole family's experience, is truly commendable, because a lot of people have relationships, some connections that people have either been lost to mental illness, to drug addiction, and all that they really gain from it is a friend to lean on or a friend to support on. But what you were able to offer is support, is hope, is, you know, a full-on resource for caregivers and people that went through your experience, which it's so incredible to see. And, you know, we'll speak more about the support that you offer soon, but I really do want to touch upon, you know, your brother was one to call you and reach out for the support, but not a
Right.
lot of people are able to do that. I think one thing that's hard to notice is signs from someone who is depressed, suicidal, who is experiencing this pain. Were you able to see any signs, or were you able to see any tendencies of what your brother was able to, you know, experiencing during this pain and trauma? Because I think it's important for those caregivers, or just the people who are connected with someone with a mental illness, to try to notice, you know, some signs of, you know, I think isolation is one thing, but is there anything that you've been able to notice or you've been able to learn about how one may act when they're feeling this type of thought process or experience?
Right. So I should have pulled out my mental health first aid book, because I'll tell you that was one of the most informative classes I've ever taken. And I would recommend to any of your followers to take that for their own or the well-being of a friend. It's like CPR for mental health. And it really allows you to be in touch with those warning signs, and then gives you excellent coping strategies for how to work with anyone that you love or are worried about. Of course, NAMI also offers some excellent psychoeducational programming that gives you some really good detail. They are the gold standard for educational programming around mental illness. And yet we did not have any of those opportunities while we were caring for our brother. We did not know about those. We were, it's kind of one of the reasons we've launched this effort, is that people don't want to talk about mental illness. So whoever we talked to a handful of people about his suicide ideation, and yet no one ever directed us to NAMI. No one ever said to us, you yourself might want to consider counseling as you provide support to him. And so looking back, because of course I knew enough about suicide ideation and that you cannot give the idea to someone about suicide that the idea is already there. So I knew enough that you had, one of the ways that makes it preventable is to talk about it, which is really hard for the caregiver. And yet kind of is a sigh of relief, if you will, for the recipient, which is so beautiful, because you've opened this hard conversation and suddenly they're like, wow, somebody noticed. I'm worthy. I matter. They care, right? And so until that moment that he reached out, we did see a lot of red flags, Brendan, and yet didn't know what to do with it. I really, really didn't. And so some of the red flags indeed were isolation, his inability to cope with the pain and trauma, the inability to really navigate a hard conversation. Meaning, if you were to have said to him at the time, gosh, chronic pain is so hard. What are you doing about it? He would respond with a lot of anger. So anger became his go-to emotion, if you will. He also, the obsessive compulsive piece, we saw a lot of obsessional thinking that was getting worse and worse. And confronting someone with obsessional thinking is a very delicate balance, because, again, it's better saved for a trained professional, if you will, because they really don't see it at all. So somehow it became much easier to talk about the suicide ideation and all of the things that in his mind led to that than some of the underlying mental illness. And we would get him into a counselor. And of course, as you or your listeners who are facing some of the same challenges know, finding a counselor is hard enough with availability. It takes a long time to get into a counselor of any kind, of any credentials. And then finding a counselor that's a good fit is also really hard. And what I'm now coming to find out is that our story is not unusual, that the person living with mental illness is very choosy, if you will, about that fit. And so we had to try many, many, many counselors and therapists until we could find one that he felt was the right fit. And I'm not sure if that's because he was being asked hard questions. I'm not sure if that was because the person was asking him to start making some changes of his own. I whether they were all looking to put him on medication and he was not willing to take medication because of his chronic physical pain. I don't think we'll ever know or understand that completely. I just know that it's a really big part of the challenge. So yes, we saw many red flags, and yes, that's one of the hardest parts of the journey, is navigating what do we do with this information. Why I find myself now telling people in the same story, in the same position, is that there are trained professionals who are there to support you in your journey of caregiving as well. Our programs and services help to a certain point, but when you're trying to help a loved one get into treatment and secure care for themselves, that is a very tricky road, and trained professionals can be very helpful in that position. Does that help?
Definitely, Chris. Yeah, I appreciate that, and I thank you for that information. There's a lot of great points that you made. The first one being, we will be sure to have the link to the mental health aid book or NAMI's resources in terms of someone to be able to seek out those classes and those resources in order to understand some of these signs and availability in terms of learning more about this issue so you can be ready if someone around you is facing this issue. I think that's so important. And you touched on a great theme, that is, you were able to see these signs, but you necessarily did not have the resources in order to know what's the next step.
Right.
That seems to be a big problem within mental illness today, because you spoke about that finding a therapist is not too hard, but finding the right therapist for what you're seeking out is extremely hard. And
Right.
just finding the availability to meet one therapist is hard enough. I have a lot of people around me that have been going through 1, 2, or 3, and some are not even able to be booked out until 2 or 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge lack of resources within social workers, therapists, and so forth in terms of allowing a support system for someone to seek out any type of therapy or coaching throughout their life. I think that's something that really needs to change within the field. So I'm glad you brought up that point of it being so hard, because there's one aspect of you needing to accept, because you've been speaking a lot about acceptance, which I think is so important, of accepting what you're going through and what you need, creating that plan of what is the next steps. But then securing that therapist is always a challenge, at least for a lot of people that I hear and speak about today. There's also, one big issue that I think happens a lot throughout the mental health field within, categorizing mental illnesses. I think there's a lot of different misconceptions and misnomers about, what mental illness is, who are the people that are struggling from this issue. And it's really kind of this gray area that not a lot of people are able to speak about. So if you could give us some more insight in terms of, what are some misconceptions that you have seen about mental illness, and maybe try to clarify what mental illness is and why it can categorize under a lot of different mental issues, instead of, just some specific, you know the difference between, like a clinical depression or that depressive thinking, that small change of your emotions rather than an actual chemical imbalance.
And this is so important. This is just such an important distinction. And because of the work I do, I talk to people all the time. I talk to caregivers, I talk to loved ones, so they happen to be sometimes siblings like I was, and then sometimes, many times, they're parents supporting a child or an adolescent or an emerging young adult. A lot of times they're supporting parents. Sometimes they're supporting friends or colleagues or partners. So lots of different relationships here. And in those many, many conversations, there are people, first of all, there's the DSM, which is I want to say the American Psychological, let's just say Society, or board that has created the DSM. And there's probably a more technical way of looking at that, but the DSM is what dictates what is diagnosed as a mental illness. And that umbrella under the DSM is really, really wide, very wide. So it's easy to find out if this certain condition falls under that diagnosable chart, if you will. And it's changing on a fairly regular basis. So things kind of come in and come out, if you will, but some things that have stayed true, if you will, throughout. So sometimes a learning difference might appear on the DSM. So things like attention deficit, dyslexia, things like epilepsy, things like autism, again, any sort of way that your brain is different and falls under the DSM is when you would be categorized, if you will, as having a mental illness. Dementia, Alzheimer's also follows under that umbrella. And yet, there's some people that have a much more narrow definition, if you will, of mental illness, and they tend to go into that severe mental illness kind of bucket, if you will, which is things like the schizoaffective disorder spectrum. Then you've got manic depressive bipolar. You've got the clinical depression in that bucket because it can be absolutely debilitating. And yet you've got things like anxiety, which when someone has clinical anxiety, it's absolutely paralyzing to their lives, to their everyday lives. And so we tend to see people in that more severe mental illness bucket, if you will, because, well, first of all, there's a lot of great services for Alzheimer's and dementia out there. The Alzheimer's Association does a great job. So they are serving those families really, really well. And so I think we may have seen one family in the last few months that's supporting someone with dementia. And then things like the learning differences are so being handled so well by the schools that we don't tend to see families who are supporting people with learning differences. Then again, there's that severe mental illness category, which is where we tend to see and support the most families, because that's where they feel as if it's been the hardest to both find resources as well as navigate the journey with their loved ones and either their school systems, their counties, their state, the federal government, helping their loved ones to effectively manage, if you will, life. And so that's where we tend to see and support the most people. But the best way to find out is just go to that DSM, and it's right out there. And I think we're in, I don't know which iteration we are of it, but that's usually where I go as my gold standard. Here's the great thing about Courage to Caregivers, though, Brandon, is that I've had funders who've said, we only want you to focus on the severe mental illness category. And I said, that's great. But if someone comes in and has the courage to come in because they are so vulnerable and so fragile, I am not going to check their credentials at the door of where their loved one's mental illness falls. I know how hard it would be just to get the threshold of the door for our services, that if they feel as if our programs and services meet their needs and would help reduce their stress of the burden of caregiving for their loved one, then they are welcome to avail themselves of our programs and services. And so that's kind of where we have taken the definition to very broadly say, if you feel as if our solution works for you, then please come and please participate. And we hope that we can help to reduce that stress.
That's incredible, Kristi. I love that you widen that spectrum to offer people to come and receive the support and service that you provide, no matter what it's characterized under. You guys offer an important service because not only are the people struggling with a mental illness suffering, the caregivers are as well, and they're feeling an emotional harm and experience due to a lot of this support and healing process.
Hmm.
I think you touched a lot on courage caregivers, but I'd like you to go more into detail. So when someone comes to you, they
Hmm.
say, all right, I have somebody within my connection experiencing a mental illness. After that point, you accept them, bring them into the community. What type of services and opportunities and support do you offer to the caregivers at that next step?
Right. And so such a great question because I'll kind of back it up and preface by saying the best referral when I can speak to someone on the phone or connect with them in electronically versus over email or something like that, and really understand what they're looking for and what their goals are as a caregiver, I'm able to really articulate what we do and what we do not do. And I think that's important because we want to make sure that we're meeting the expectations of the caregivers. Like I said, it takes a lot of vulnerability and a lot of courage to come to the door and step foot into one of our programs and services. So they're in that fragile place. And I want to make sure that their expectations meet what we are able to provide. And so in those phone conversations, it's almost like triage as I'm listening to their story and where they are personally and how they're managing and where they are. I've actually referred more people away from us to other agencies and services. And here's why. You have to be ready to focus on yourself and your self-care to avail yourself of our services. And this is how we're so different. We're focused entirely on the caregiver and their self-care. A huge part of our mission is to make sure that people understand that self-care is not selfish. And I'll step back for a second and share. It's always the hardest part for me. People are like, how did you make this leap from supporting your brother to suddenly creating an organization focused on self-care? And really, that's the personal part, right? Is that during those 4 years of supporting my brother, every time the phone rang, I dropped everything. I went out to my porch and I sat there for between 2 and 3 hours and just listened. And I wouldn't say that came naturally. It took us a while to get into that groove. I realized he did not want advice. He did not want my perspective. He just needed me to listen. So we got to that place and I would literally just listen for 2 to 3 hours, affirm and acknowledge what he was feeling. He would every single time hang up saying, thank you so much. I feel so much better having had this time together. And I would leave feeling completely depleted in my energy and resources, completely exhausted. And I would head right into my kitchen and eat my way back into feeling better myself. And what happened was over those 4 years, I gained 50 pounds. And I'm an emotional eater. I wish I could blame him for that time. I own it. But in that time, again, no one was looking out for me and saying, gosh, this must be really hard. How are you doing? How are you taking care of yourself? And so what I've realized is it's the whole oxygen mask thing. When the flight attendant tells you to put on your own oxygen mask first before helping those around you, it's for a reason. It's because you only actually have 12 seconds, if it really were an emergency, to help those around you before you would pass out. So if you don't put on that oxygen mask first, you would pass out, and then what good would you be to those around you? Useless. So we know, there is evidence-based research that says when you take better care of yourself, you actually provide much better care to those that you love. And so looking back, I obviously had a lot to learn, and I needed to have reprioritized my own health and well-being while also supporting him and his health and well-being. I needed to reprioritize and make sure that my own health and well-being and my own relationships were also not suffering. So what we are doing in our curriculum is that we are working with caregivers who are ready to reprioritize themselves, ready to take care of themselves in this process of providing care to those that they love. And we are actually coaching life skills. So when I say that we provide a support group, it's not in the most traditional sense. We are actually have a 52-week curriculum, and each month have a different theme, and each week have a different topic. And we coach our participants around that topic. We do not provide counseling or therapy. It's only coaching. And so we provide information, tools, and resources about a topic for that week. We discuss it as a group and talk about how, as caregivers, we might incorporate some of those tools into our daily life to provide some actual changes for us, the caregiver, that might then have beneficial effects on our loved ones. But we really never talk about our loved ones, and we rarely talk about mental illness. We're really focused on making healthy changes in ourselves, bringing out those tools. And they're usually tools people have in their toolbox. We're allowing them to dust them off and practice them within the relationship of caregiver, if you will. So we start our evening every week with breathing meditation for 1 hour, knowing that when you reclaim your breath, it has so much energy and positive results. And so we have a breathing meditation facilitator that takes the topic, and we provide some meditation and movement around that topic. And then we move into support group, like I said, which is more self-care coaching sessions, if you will. They are facilitated by licensed counselors or social workers. And we always provide homework. So they go home with a handout with a recap of the week, some tools for them to practice at home. And then they come back the next week ready to kind of process just for a few minutes. So how did that go? What did you learn? What worked well? What could you be doing better? And there's that value of the group think where they all help each other through that. The third program I'll mention is that we also offer, we call it one-to-one caregiver support, but we offer peer support for mental illness caregivers. And we believe we're the first ones to provide that. There's a lot of peer support out there, really great peer support for our loved ones living with the mental illness, which is entirely governed and sanctioned by the state organizations. And we believe we have a model to provide that peer support for the first time for the caregivers. So we actually take people's applications, but they're really registrations. We get a registration from a caregiver looking for support. We actively seek a volunteer that we can train through a series of webinars. We match them based on their stories and then send them off on their way to provide a one-on-one caring relationship. So those are our 3 programs that we are offering as a 1-year pilot in our launch phase. And we're just in the process of measuring the impact. And actually, I have some great stories about how we already know that our programs are working, but I'll see if you have any questions because I gave you a lot of information.
Awesome, Kristi. That was incredible, and we'll definitely be able to speak about some of those stories that provide insight into more of how productive and effective your work is, and we'll get to that in a minute. There's just some things that I really wanted to speak upon. One being, I just have to pay respect to you for the way that you handled the situation in terms of putting everything aside to prioritize your brother first. That speaks a lot about who you are and why you are so dedicated to creating a change. That also plays into a big part of, you realizing that you were most important as well. Your care was directly affected by someone else's instances and issues that they were facing and they were really challenged by. I loved that you brought up the put on your own oxygen mask before helping those around you. When I was reading more about what you do, more about Courage to Caregivers, that was one thing that really popped out to me. And I wanted to make sure that we covered that topic because self-care is so important in terms of not only the person who is experiencing the issue, but the caregiver, the person who's there helping, supporting, and providing resources for those who are struggling from mental illness. It's so important that everybody takes care of themselves in a healthy manner, not only their physical health, their mental health, their emotional health. It's all so important in terms of how we're able to live our life and how we're able to interact and communicate with others. If we're not mentally or emotionally healthy, that can have drastic effects in terms of, how we can care and provide support for ones that are struggling around us. I love that you brought that up. And I really want to speak about some self-care routines and habits before we speak about some stories about your productivity rate within your services. Is there any self-care routines or habits that you really try to promote for some of your caregivers to try, whether it's during the activity or after? Obviously, meditation and breathing is a huge key in terms of your program thus far, but what other opportunities do you provide for your caregivers to try self-care activities?
Right. So that's a great question because every single week is a different way to focus on self-care. All of our topics that we have in our curriculum is a new way to explore being able to take care of yourself. For instance, this week is reconnecting or connecting, I should say, with nature. So it's actually called ecotherapy. There's a name for that. And so, we know that when you just literally step outside to breathe fresh air, you feel better. Your stress is reduced. Your blood pressure comes down. It certainly helps when it's good weather, of course, but even in bad weather, just getting fresh air is really important. And for some people, we may say, hey, exercise is a great form of self-care. So go out and exercise, take a walk. And for me, I'm in a blessed situation where I can go out and take a walk. There are plenty of people out there who are caring for those with mental illness who are on suicide watch 24/7, who are like, Kristi, I can't leave the house. I'm focused on my loved one. I can't do that. So we've changed our thinking to saying, well, you know what? Open the front door, keep your eye on your loved one, open your front door, step outside, breathe in the fresh air, consider taking your loved one with you if you can do that, take a chair outside, really looking at it as even just very simply exercise and taking a walk, just being very, very simple. So again, when we go back to exercise as a form of self-care, you don't have to join a fancy gym. You can go to a park. You can go walk in your neighborhood. We always encourage you to take a friend. So socialization and building community. Find someone you trust that shares the same passion for walking or hiking or heading to the park. Take your dog. Pet therapy is a great way to provide self-care. My dog loves me unconditionally more than anyone else. He loves to see me no matter what his mood, and he loves to take a walk with me. I spoke earlier. I just came in from the garden. So just getting your hands in the dirt. There's evidence-based research that digging in the dirt is actually both really healthy and then also reduces your stress, provides some cortisol. And so in your brain, which again provides energy and it reduces your own kind of affliction or not affliction tendencies towards depressive thinking. Let's see, what are some other things? Reading a book. So taking the topic of lifelong learning, if you will, sign up for a free class online, explore a new topic more deeply, go to a lecture at the library, go to a speaker at your bookstore, join a book club or start a book club. Healthy nutrition and healthy eating. So grab a good healthy cookbook or share recipes with friends. Try something new in the kitchen. We know that when you cook healthy meals, it provides more energy and nutrients to your body. I could go on and on and on. I will tell you that we are in week 16 of our pilot, and every one of our topics, copies of our weekly inspirational email that we have, you can both sign up on our website, but then those are listed under our blog on our website as topics that, again, build skills around self-care for the caregiver.
Thank you for that, Kristi. Those are a lot of great values and activities that I think most can focus on and can drastically improve the way that they even look at their situation and their approach of their own experience within mental illness and their relationships around themselves. A lot of those activities and values actually relate to a lot of what the organization my good friend Mark Metry and I founded, called Metamorphosis, and we promote a lot of those values in terms of nutrition, exercise, gratitude, emotional intelligence. I think we'll have a lot to collaborate and connect with over the future days, weeks, and months to come. I think we'll be able to provide a lot of resources and opportunities for both of our audiences in order to really try to drive change within this field. So I'm really excited to continue our connection and work within those, because we do have a lot of key values that are similar within both of our projects. Yours focusing on the caregiver, and ours focusing on the one experiencing the mental illness. So I'm really looking forward to connecting more and collaborating and sharing our own stories and our own experiences within our support, our resources. So I'm so grateful that we do share those values. One value that we truly do focus on a lot is gratitude. I think gratitude is so important
Yes.
to change your perspective, change the way that you appreciate your life. It keeps you grounded. It opened my eyes to allowing myself to see a positive light within my own life, within my relationships around me. Gratitude was one of the key changes that I used to change my own relationship within myself and others. I love gratitude. It's something that I really focus on within journaling and as well within just my communication with others. Can you speak about gratitude and its impact upon our own mental health?
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And we had gratitude as one of our topics one week and explored some of those great ways to look at it for self-care, and journaling was right up there, right? I mean, journaling has so many wonderful benefits, but we actually, so here's an actual testimonial, if you will, from one of our participants that week. And I think that the primary caregiver, as they're looking at their role with their loved one, and sometimes that can be tenuous, right? You're trying to get them back on track. Sometimes it's about you, and really it should be about them. And so the relationship is fragile, if you will. And so this person just happened to be a mom supporting an emerging young adult. And yet this example was really not about that relationship at all. It was actually stepping back and her recognizing at the end of us discussing gratitude for about an hour and all the different ways we can show and express our gratitude towards others and how important that was to how we feel in our side ourselves. She stepped back and she said, "Oh my goodness, I don't think I've ever thanked my husband." And we looked at her and we said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I don't think I've ever thanked him for supporting us on this journey, supporting me so that I could come here on a weekly basis and participate." She just hadn't seen it as a form of gratitude towards him for her own journey of being the primary caregiver, if you will, for being an equal partner. And she said, "I think I'm going to go home and just thank him for all of the ways he supports me and see what happens." And this is a family where not only has the participant been affected by the topics that we explore in our groups, her relationship with her partner, her husband in this case, has been transformed. And then also, as a result, the entire family has been impacted because, again, of some very small, subtle changes that this participant has taken advantage of. In her case, it was orally saying thank you to her partner in crime, if you will. In many cases, it's just acknowledging that you are not alone in this journey. And so saying thank you to anyone who provides support to you in this journey, whether it's listening to you, whether it's walking with you, whether it's covering for you at work because you have to take some time off work to provide care to your loved one, whether it's a family member who's also giving you some respite care, if you will, which is really helpful. And then again, by just expressing that gratitude, whether it's oral or written, or perhaps it's baking something in return to say thank you, whatever that gratitude is shown, we know what it does is it takes you outside of yourself. It allows you to realize, wow, I'm part of I call it Team Kristi, if you will, in my case. So Team Kristi is supporting me in this journey, and I need every single one of them, but for a different purpose. And so acknowledging your team of support, because it takes that team to do this journey, is just, again, it physically and scientifically, we know it, that cortisol in your brain, um, it just, it's magical. It just gives you so much energy, and you realize you're not alone. That's how I look at gratitude.
I love that perspective, Kristi. It's such an important theme within anyone who is surrounded by someone struggling with a mental illness. It's really something that I've been able to understand more, and realizing how important relationships are, whether it's the one directly with the one suffering from a mental illness or it's the surrounding parties. There's a lot of intertwined connections that are extremely valuable to focus on and correct anything that may be displaced between that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the time that I've been speaking with those who have experienced mental illnesses and who are trying to heal and recover, the one thing that really is a main topic is that isolation, not feeling self-worth, not focusing on the self-care, and not realizing that the relationships around them are drastically important. One being that family, I think, loses a lot of value, and I think that's due to a lot of the self-worth that is being depleted throughout that person, because whether it's there seeking to end some sort of pain or due to some trauma or experience, the issue revolves around really not trying to understand and appreciate the relationships around us. That's why relationships are really something that I extremely value, and I try to find the most time to work within them and focus that I'm giving 110% towards the person and people around me that are of value and that follow the same mindset and approach, whether it's a family member, a friend, or a classmate or a coworker. You know, these relationships are all directly reflective of yourself, of the way you see the world, of the way you see yourself. I think they all combine together in terms of, you know, the character and the values that you focus on within your life. I'm really happy that you were able to provide that source of, you know, testimonial approach to the work that Courage to Caregivers is doing so far. I'd like to offer this time before I ask my last question to my guests. I really want to offer this time. One, if you want to offer another testimonial about one of the values and activities you focused on throughout one of the weeks thus far, or if you want to share any lessons or any tip that you've been able to uncover, or if you just want to offer this time to share a story or an experience that was of deep value that my audience would gain a lot of insight out of.
That's, you've given me a lot of choices there, Brendan. Let me think. I think for me personally, when we began the in-person programming and started meeting people where they are, but really in person, right? These are live humans. No longer are you throwing out information on the internet, and so through social media, making a difference there. Our emails that we send out weekly are meant to be really inspirational emails with content that asks caregivers, to really potentially make some changes for themselves or look at something in a new way. And we're hearing great feedback there that certain topics are really resonating with people as they provide care and how much help that provides. But really seeing people real and in life, and the changes that are taking place in them, to see people's stress reduced, that during that breathing meditation, they walk in with stress at a level 7, 8, 9, sometimes even 10 from their day. And that could be a compilation of both work and their caregiving responsibilities, that to watch their stress literally and physically reduce as a result of focusing on their breathing and making that a priority in their lives and wanting to incorporate that more regularly through a variety of sources in addition to our program has just been amazing. But really, to see those people willing to do the hard work that we're asking them to do. And it's hard. It's hard to look at yourself in this equation and think, I need to make some changes here. This is not all about my loved one and what they are or are not doing or have the capacity or not to do. This is really all about me and what is the one thing that we are in control of? It's ourselves. And so being willing to consider some changes within themselves, first of all, and then next to see how that has literally affected entire families and the relationships with their loved ones is just so humbling for me. It exceeded any expectation of how we could be making an impact. I really thought we'd be helping some caregivers to not feel so alone, because that's what I wanted, to not feel so alone. And yet we are helping entire families in their coping around some really hard things. And so it, again, has been a very humbling experience. It has exceeded every expectation I ever had for what we could do. And we're just getting started. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. So we are so lucky to have people in our pilots who recognize that this is a pilot, that we're trying some new things that have never been tried before, and they're willing to give us that feedback. And so now it's time for us to really listen to that feedback and start incorporating it over the next 2 really trimesters as we continue to move forward. So we're very excited.
That's incredible, Chris. Yeah, I'm so happy to hear this. I think the services and the support that you're providing within Courage to Caregivers is absolutely commendable. I want to say that through my perspective, it seems that you kickstarting this really caused a huge wave of inspiration and motivation for these caregivers to want to go out and seek that help. Without you wanting to share your story, share your experience, and create this organization, not as many caregivers would be able to seek out the support. You're providing a extremely beneficial and important service for those who are around ones struggling with mental illness. I just want to express my full gratitude and respect to you for the work that you do, because the lives that you touch are so drastically important. Many people around myself have experienced a mental illness, and I've seen direct reflection in terms of the caregivers and those supporting those experiencing the issue have even their own negative or traumatic experiences due to this whole process, this whole recovery process, which is very intuitive and deep and grueling process that we all need support within. So when I heard of Courage Caregivers, I was so happy to jump on board to share your story and share more about what you're doing, because you are a one-in-one organization today. And I really, truly hope that it continues throughout the country, because this support is needed everywhere for all of the caregivers to those experiencing mental illness. So I really just want to thank you for that. And I truly appreciate you coming on this podcast today. It's really been a pleasure thus far, Kristi. It's wonderful to hear what you're doing today, because I'm so grateful and thankful that you are doing the work that you do and you feel so passionate about it. You are a firsthand experiencer of knowing this issue, and I think that's why you provide so much care, love, and support to everyone out there.
Well, it's been such a privilege, and I loved the opportunity to get to know you a little bit better and all the hard work that you're providing. And I really look forward to being able to partner going forward and collaborate on even more opportunities to look at this issue and go a little deeper. So I know that together we can do great things. I appreciate it.
That's so great to hear, Chrissy. I'm so excited to continue this connection because I do think we'll have some great collaboration, and just having this conversation is the first step. And once we continue to build upon this, share our own stories and share what we're experiencing, what events and services we're doing, what works and what doesn't work, we'll then be able to move forward in terms of really reducing this mental health crisis and start to really help more and more people that are experiencing these issues. Because even the people that are experiencing these issues, there's still a percentage that aren't seeking out and aren't sharing what they're experiencing. So there's still a range of people that we can still touch, support, and care for. I really want to ask you this last question because I think you'll have some great insight towards it. What I like to ask my guests for their last question is a question based on their current year as they're going through. So I like to ask, if you were to be writing a book about yourself, and this will be going through different stages and different proponents of what you've experienced throughout your life, I want to ask you, through this year, I think this will be a great question in terms of what you're currently going through with Courage to Caregivers in this first year launch. What would be the chapter of, say, the beginning of 2019 and what you're looking towards in this next year of, what's a topic or theme that this chapter would be, and why do you see this as an important topic to show within your life and within all the experiences that you've been able to learn thus far?
Wow, that is a really big question. What would I call this chapter? Um, I think we're past the introduction, we're past the getting to know you, and really where I feel like we are, or I am in this journey, is looking at scale. And so it's not a very sexy title, if you will. I'm not sure it's going to sell a lot of copies. And yet, at the same time, it's a really important topic. So how are we going to take what we are doing in Northeast Ohio in two locations, the east and west side of the city, where we have very different audiences, if you will? How do we take what we're doing here, and what does that look like going forward? And so scale has just been something that's on my mind all the time. I am not an entrepreneur by nature. I am not someone who jumps off cliffs. I am not someone who thrives on the excitement of trying new things, if you will. And yet, a social entrepreneur, so I saw a problem and I decided I wanted to look at a possible solution. So I'm more of a problem solver than I am an entrepreneur. And yet, when I look at how the work and research and thoughtfulness and planning that has taken to get us this far, I also know we can't be complacent. We can't stand still. So what are we doing going forward? We're not going to repeat the same 52 weeks, 1-year curriculum over and over and over again in perpetuity, because that would not be serving our participants. And yet, how do we look at scaling what we do going forward so that we can reach more people? We get calls from people all over the world thanks to social media. And I think that's how we even found each other and reached out and connected. So as you connect with people and the need is so great, how do we take what we're doing right here in this little pocket and move forward? And I have lots of ideas for problems that are things that we still have not solved, like the guy code. So here I am sitting with this fabulous young man who's passionate about mental illness. How do I get more men to come to our programs and services? We're starting to get a handful, but not too many. Then I look at college students. I happen to have 3 emerging young adults. We've just kind of finished that chapter in most cases, yet we still have a college student. And I happen to know that there's a lot of college students out there who are trying to support their friends without a lot of tools and resources and having to wait 2, 3, 6 weeks for the college guidance office to get into a therapy session? How do we help those college students to be better caregivers? So I see some problems within our current model for some unmet need, and how do we scale what we're doing to meet the needs of more people? So I think scale is the name of the chapter, because that's where my brain is, just thinking about what we look like in 2020 and how we can help more people going forward.
That's awesome. I do think that's an important theme and topic that is extremely important, especially when you're in your beginning phases of a nonprofit organization, because yes, you want to see, which I think this year is going to be a great testament towards it, is, what's the retention rate? How do you effectively help people going through? And once you have a proven model, then that scaling aspect becomes that much easier. I definitely am going to try to think and see which types of areas that we can help you scale your own company, and try to allow for more people to see the importance of Courage to Caregivers, and how we can actively bring a larger audience within the male field, within the college student field. I think there's definitely a lot of more availability that people can begin to reach out and see the importance of Courage to Caregivers. I'm definitely going to continue to, deeply think about this in terms of what we can help you with in terms of scaling that, because I think Courage to Caregivers is such a valuable piece of support and resource for those who are deeply affected by the issue of mental illness. I really just want to thank you again, Kristi, for coming on this interview with me. You were episode number 17 of the Mental Insights podcast, and it truly was such a great time sharing what Courage Caregivers is, the story and the experience that you have been through, and to show people really what the future entails of yourself and the work that you're doing today. I think it's so valuable to show how motivating and inspiring your life and experiences have been. I think your story and work in and of itself is going to inspire and drive a lot of people to, one, not only help and offer support to serve others, but as well to seek out and ask for help when it's needed. I really appreciate you coming on here today, Kristi. It was such a great time speaking with you, and I really look forward to continuing this connection, because we have a lot of similar values, and I'm really excited to help you grow Courage to Caregivers in any way that I can. So if there's anything that I can do that you do know, please let me know, but I will be actively thinking about ways to help your own nonprofit organization, Courage to Caregivers, and try to shed a more positive light on why caregivers need to seek out such an important service that you provide. So thank you, Kristi. It was such a wonderful time speaking with you.
Thank you, Brendan. I just appreciate this opportunity so much. I look forward to the future.